Our Springfield Board of Mayor and Alderman special meeting is called to session. I will turn it over to our city manager, Mr. Ryan Martin.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you to everybody attending tonight. As you remember, earlier this year in our strategic planning session, we talked about and discussed the idea of implementing a system development charge, a system development fee to offset some of the ratepayer burden, some of the taxpayer burden on all the growth that we're having. We are now well into that process, and Tischler Bice is the consultant that you all approved a contract with. Carson Bice is here from Tischler Bice to report on that and give you all sort of an overview. This will be the first of two of these meetings that we will have. So, if Mayor, if it's okay with you, we'll turn it over to Carson.
Yes, sir. Welcome to the mic.
Thank you, Mayor. It's my pleasure to be here. I'd like to keep this informal, so if anybody has any questions, feel free to interrupt me on any particular slide. You know, as part of these impact fee studies, we believe in doing stakeholder outreach with the building and other related industries as part of this process, and we just finished a meeting with the stakeholders right before this one, and we thought this would be a good time to introduce this topic to you as a board and allow you the chance to find out more about impact fees, ask me questions about impact fees in general and other related questions, you know, before you know, we come back to you. I assume at some point we're probably gonna come to you with a work session with the draft fees, and there may be, for particular impact fee categories, maybe two approaches, and so we wanna get feedback from you all as a body on which approach is preferable, because it may have a dollar sign attached to it. And so, and then obviously there'll be the adoption process as well. So with that, I'll just get started, and again, interrupt me at any point. Our firm, Tischler Bice, we're based in Bethesda, Maryland, in Boise, Idaho. We're the national leader in impact fees and fiscal and economic impact studies. We've done more of that work than anybody in the country. We also do real estate market feasibility studies, utility rate studies as well. As you can see here, we've also done quite a bit of work in the state of Tennessee. And as Candace mentioned in her presentation to the stakeholders, and I'd never really thought about it until she mentioned it, but most of the impact fees in Tennessee are in Middle Tennessee. You don't find them in West Tennessee and East Tennessee, so that's an interesting situation. You know, it surprises a lot of communities we work with that, you know, there aren't a whole lot of tools in the toolbox, so to speak, in terms of funding sources or financing mechanisms when it comes to financing infrastructure. And that's true to, you know, no matter what state we're in, and as you can well imagine, different states have different revenue structures. But you know, we basically have two choices, or three choices really. One is we could fund infrastructure from growth from our broad-based revenue sources, which depending on the state you're in tend to be income taxes, sales taxes, and property taxes, and sometimes a combination thereof. But the problem is that those are also the revenue sources we rely on to fund our general operations, and as we know, you know, it's the operating costs that kill you, so to speak. It's not so much the one-time capital costs. And so to the extent you can move away from that revenue source and find other financing mechanisms, because as we all know, we don't treat the general fund like an enterprise fund. We don't say, hey, it's gonna cost us $30 million to run general government this year, so the property tax has to be X, which is basically the exercise your enterprise funds go through. They set their rates to cover the cost. So we can either use those broad-based revenues, or we can choose as a community that we're just going to accept lower levels of service, which I think most communities don't want to do. And so otherwise, we've got to find other financing mechanisms. So that's one of the reasons impact fees and system development charges, which are sort of used interchangeably, also sometimes known as benefit assessments, et cetera, are very popular, particularly in fast-growing Sunbelt communities and faster-growing Western communities we work with on an ongoing basis. So when we look at other options, there's, you know, the impact fees, system development charges. A lot of communities, particularly from stormwater, are moving to basically setting up stormwater utilities, where there's a utility rate charge every month, typically attached to your electric bill or your sewer bill. Also, some progressive communities have basically set up their transportation network as a utility. That's happened in Oregon, Florida, and Colorado. We also have special purpose sales taxes, which I'm not sure are authorized in Tennessee, where you can go out to the voters and get a sales tax specific to funding transportation. So,
I think so.
yeah, I don't think so either. But in Florida, you can do that. And then there's also special assessments or special taxing districts or special benefit districts. They all have different names depending on the state, but the idea here is that you would set up an area of the city or a particular subdivision and set up a special district where there is a levy placed against different property owners to fund different types of infrastructure and/or services. So for instance, when we've set these up for a special transportation district, there's got to be some sort of methodology that shows that what you're paying is commensurate to the amount of front footage you have on the road, et cetera, et cetera. Excise or development taxes are very popular. Tennessee does have a form of that. The counties have the ability to, I know in Williamson County where we did the school fee, there is the adequate facilities tax, and there's also a privilege tax as well. That's an example of that. I know your county has at least one of those. And in some states, they're starting to get innovative. Like in Georgia, there's a few communities that are taxing insurance premiums and generating $5 or $6 or $7 million a year, and then dedicating it to a particular infrastructure category. For instance, like buying fire engines and replacements, that kind of thing. Also, jurisdictional revenue sharing is getting popular, as well as public-private partnerships. So when we talk about impact fees or system development charges, whatever you want to call it, why are communities adopting this? As we talked about on the previous slide, obviously there's this desire to maintain existing levels of service, which is huge for communities because you're struggling to do that because you're getting unfunded mandates and people really don't like to see their property taxes raised. Also, it ensures that new growth pays its equitable share. And I can tell you in communities that are fast growing that we've worked in that the citizens are anti-growth. Their fears can be somewhat assuaged if they have some confidence that new growth is paying their fair share for infrastructure through impact fees, right? Because of the accounting requirements associated with impact fees, where you have to publish an annual report, you've got to dedicate the revenue to certain categories and certain funds. It does promote disciplined capital improvement programming and planning. Depending on how innovative you want to be with the methodology, it can help with promoting comprehensive planning, economic development, and transportation goals. For instance, we do a lot of fees for transportation around the country that vary by vehicle miles of travel, meaning that if you're in the fringes of a community, you're paying a higher fee, but if you're in the center of the community, you're paying a lower fee because you're consuming less roadway infrastructure. So that could go a long way to helping to facilitate, like for instance in Bozeman, Montana, downtown redevelopment. Same thing in Missoula, Montana. We crafted the same kind of fee. Also, when you go to an impact fee or a system development charge system, what we have found is that if you are a community where you sort of have an ad hoc exaction program where, depending on the development that comes through the door, there's a different ask depending on the situation. So you may be asking the developer to improve an intersection or build a turn lane and dedicate land for parks. It's hard for them to work that into their financing package because it varies from project to project, where if you've got a set schedule, it's very easy for them to put into their pro formas, and if they know they're going to pay X amount of dollars for road, X amount of dollars for parks, et cetera. Now, when we define what an impact fee or system development charge is, it is important to note that they are one-time payments, right? Where this is not an ongoing charge. When I come through the door as the builder to pull my building permit, let's just say the fees total $10,000, that's the time that the fee is due. In most cases, some communities have adopted it as certificate of occupancy, but we wouldn't recommend that. There are limitations on the dollars. We just can't mix them in with the general fund. We're not supposed to really use them for maintenance or replacements. The idea is we're creating net new infrastructure. And I think it's important to note that they are not a tax. And the reason I stress that is I often hear them called a tax on new development. And it's important to distinguish what a tax is versus a fee. Taxes are designed primarily to raise revenue, right? And in some states like Colorado, you have to go to the voters to even get authority to increase your property tax, for instance. And so fees are very different. Fees are typically designed to cover the cost of a service. In this case, they're designed to cover the cost of a facility. So, if you think about, the fees to use the recreation center, for instance, usually that's designed to cover the cost of the program, the cost of the staff, and any overhead support. It's not designed to generate excess revenue. With impact fees or system development charges, it's the same kind of concept, but it's much stricter because we have to meet 3 legs of a legal stool. One is we have to show through the study the nexus or the need. So the study has to document that Springfield's been growing, that growth's going to continue over time, and that growth's going to generate the need for infrastructure if we want to maintain current levels of service. The second thing we have to show is benefit, and we show benefit in 2 ways. One is through the timing of the expenditure, so that means we just don't collect money and let it sit in the park account for 15 years, right? We have to spend the money within a reasonable period of time. Some statewide impact fee acts actually tell you how much or what time you have to spend the money. Like in Arizona, it's 10 years, and South Carolina, I think it's 7 years. So but the idea is here, we just don't sit on the money. We also show benefit geographically, and that's not really an issue I think that we'll have to deal with here. And it's typically something we deal with in large cities or very large counties where we're trying to guard against collecting money, let's say in the east, but then building infrastructure capacity in the west for which that fee payer doesn't benefit. And then finally, we have to show proportionality. And that's why when you see the system development charge schedule, you're going to see that it's bifurcated into single family versus multifamily, retail versus office versus commercial, because all of these land uses generate different indicators of demand. So for instance, for parks, where usually the demand is based on your population, single family homes in most communities in the United States have more people than a multifamily apartment. So they pay a higher fee. Just like retail generates more trips than office and commercial. So that's why their street impact fee is larger, okay? So that's what we mean by proportionality. When we talk about how we, as the consultant collaborating with the city in terms of methodologies, the way to think about it is you can look to the past, you can look to the present, or you can look to the future. And sometimes we do use a combination of these methodologies even within one fee category, and I'll give you an example of that in a second. So the cost recovery is basically where the city has, either through foresight or by accident, has oversized or excess capacity in the system. And so the idea here is we're going to recoup a portion of that investment. So a lot of times we see that with utilities where the city may have a wastewater treatment plant that's 5 million gallons a day, and it's currently operating at 2.5. And so new growth is going to basically buy into that remaining 2.5 million gallons a day of capacity, so you can recoup that investment or make growth-related contributions to the debt service payments if you have debt. We also sometimes use that approach where, let's say a community has just built a brand new public safety center 3 years ago, and it's been oversized to serve new development. We'll calculate new growth's fair share of that. The most common method we use is what we call the consumption-based or your incremental expansion method, which looks sort of at today or the present. It has a lot of flexibility. So basically it looks at, well, where are we in terms of our level of service in a quantitative way. So for instance, I'll use parks again as an example. Let's say if we look at our park system and compare it to our population, we have 3.5 acres per 1,000. Well, we know that it costs us $25,000 an acre, and it costs us X amount of dollars to develop the park. And so the idea here is we're going to incrementally expand our park system over 10 years. And although we're not saying that we're going to build Park A, Park B, or Park C, we still will do an analysis that shows, well, if we apply these levels of service standards to the projected development, over the next 10 years, the city has to build 100 acres of parks. Well, you could choose to build 150 acres of parks. It's just new growth's only going to pay 100, because otherwise that's an increase in the level of service. And then when we look to the future, that's usually based on an adopted master plan, like a transportation plan or a water and sewer master plan. And so it's basically, it goes out further, usually goes out 15, 20 years, and we calculate the growth shares. And sometimes you get a higher fee, but there's more exposure. And so I mentioned to you early on that we may come to you and there may be a fork in the road, okay? And maybe there's one option that's plan-based, but one that's more consumption-based, but you have to understand that if we do a plan-based calculation, and for whatever reason, let's just say growth doesn't happen in the way we project it, let's say there's a major recession, right? You still have to build that CIP, it's just the impact fee revenue is not there in the amounts you thought it was gonna be, and so the general fund is exposed, okay? Where the consumption-based method, you don't have any exposure at all. So it's immune to development trends. So for instance, if growth is slower, you're just gonna collect less money, but you just build to the level you collected. Growth is faster, you collect more money, and you build to that level, okay? So it offers more flexibility and less exposure, if you will. I'm gonna skip this since we already talked about it. One of the things we have to do within the methodology itself is guard against new development paying twice. Once through the impact fee and then again through another source of revenue. And that typically would be either existing or future debt service, or in the case where some communities have a dedicated revenue, whether it's a property tax or a sales tax or gas tax, that's going to fund growth-related infrastructure, we need to account for that in the methodology and discount the fee. So a lot of times you'll see like a gross cost per person, and then you'll see the credit against that, and you'll see a net cost per person, because we've taken into account the net present value of that revenue credit. Also, there can be times where a site-specific credit has to be given, and typically this is done through some sort of a development agreement. So a lot of times a developer will come in and as part of their project, they may proffer a park site, or they may be building a road that's in the CIP that the road impact fee or system development charge it has included in its calculation. And so you have to make the developer whole, either through discounting the fees until you've made up that value, or you can structure it where they're basically the banker, then they're paid back through a future stream of impact fee revenue, but the mechanics of that would be worked out into the development agreement. Now, the system development charges under consideration in Springfield include water and sewer, fire, parks and recreation, police, streets, general government. I know originally when the RFP was announced, there were the gas and electric utilities, and I think stormwater was also considered, but based on what we found out through discussions with city staff, it was our determination that those really don't lend themselves well to system development charges, and so it was decided to not include those within the study. Now, in terms of the process or the scope of work, it's really three different activity areas. One is quantifying demand, and so that was part of our first visits out here, where we're trying to figure out, where you are in terms of your current demographics, make the projections going forward of population and housing units. What are other housing trends that we need to be aware of? So, for instance, some communities we work in, if you look at the existing housing stock, it may be overwhelmingly single family, but if you look at the last 5 years of housing trends, it may be 50% multifamily, 50% single family, and so we need to reflect those types of changes or conditions within our projections. We also work with staff on determining recent or upcoming construction costs that we can use as the cost factors for each of the infrastructure categories. Talk about what does it cost to buy new pumpers, new ladder trucks, what's a fully outfitted police car cost with cage and all the equipment. What would you expect to pay for land, for parks, et cetera. And then also look at what are your current debt issuances, and what infrastructure categories are they for, and what are the likely funding arrangements going to be in the future for different infrastructure categories, so we can figure out what we have to do from a credit situation. Now, I did mention demographics. I just want to share a little bit with where we are today. One of the things we have to do for the residential side is determine persons per housing unit, and so we use the American Community Survey from the Census Bureau to differentiate the number of people per single family unit versus multifamily, and so we've got that data here, and I think overall the citywide average is 2.32, which is pretty standard for a community like this, or it's in the acceptable or the general range we see. We also looked at building permit history And although we know that you've got more lots approved than we're projecting, this is based on the current trend, right? And so there's about, I think, 1,050 housing units, and there's about 2,500 new residents projected over the next 10 years. And then from an employment perspective, there's about 11,500 jobs here today, and about, I can't read that from here. What does that say, Candace? How many square feet? 6.5 million, 6.3 million? Oh. Oh, yeah. 6.3 million, yeah, okay. And so this table here is data from the Institute of Transportation Engineers, and basically this is how we figure out what I just showed you for the residential in terms of persons per household. So what this does is it shows you, based on these different land use categories, what the trip rates are, which we'll use for the transportation fees, and then the number of employees you would expect to generate for every 100 or every 1,000 square feet of development. And so when you look at these gray categories, those are what we've selected as the prototype, if you will, for that type of development or the sort of the average of that type of development in the city of Springfield. So in some communities, we may be using a technology park for the industrial category, where in other communities, we may be using, light industrial or, heavy manufacturing, because that's the nature of their economy. So that's sort of the prototype of how we define the different non-residential land use categories. And speaking of those, the projections are, in terms of new employment the next 10 years, about 1,600 new jobs, and that equates to almost 900,000 square feet of additional non-residential development. Now, I think these projections are conservative, and we tend to err on the side of being conservative, which keeps you from getting sued. But also, if we're taking that consumption-based approach, and in most cases the fees are impervious to this any fluctuation. So the amount of development we're projecting doesn't influence the fee calculation, right? If we were doing a pure plan-based approach, it would. Okay, so we try to keep it so that these don't influence it. And with that, I think, next steps. So we're going to continue refining levels of service and cost data, and start getting drafts of the fees together. Typically, we call it a storyboard. We'll basically put together a presentation like this that sort of walks through each of the fee categories before we actually go to write the report, and then you guys tell us, oh, you're all wrong, and then we have to write it all over again, right? So what we'll do is then come to you and walk you through the fees, also walk the draft approaches, and walk the stakeholders through that as well. And given we're rapidly approaching, the holiday season, we anticipate that'd be either late November or early December in terms of the timing of that, if we don't have issues with that. So
Okay.
with that, happy to
Questions?
answer any questions.
Sir?
I'm pleased with the approach. Really don't have any. I really don't have anything I could add to it. I'm just pleased with the approach. We're getting where we really need to be. So.
Well, and we've already decided, sitting in this room with strategic planning, that this is the way we need to go. It's
Right.
just a matter of which approach we take. We got a lot of growth coming, and I hate to say the numbers of the new units that will be coming,
Quite a bit.
but we're gonna need new police, new fire, new everything. Every department's going to be affected. Lisa's gonna have to have more staff to take care of the additional things that the police and all of them need. Everybody's gonna be affected. And we can't continue on the same road, we know that. Mr. Gregg?
I'm excited to see what kind of revenue we can bring in.
Yeah, and that'll be, so some of the things you'll see as part of the process is, one, projections of revenue, which we do for two reasons. One, to give you an idea. Two, to check our math, because otherwise that's how we find out if we made a mistake. The other thing you'll see is we're gonna prepare a peer community comparison. So you can see what the full freight would be if you guys were to adopt 100% of the fees where you compare against White House, Portland, Murfreesboro, whoever it is you want to dial in as your comparable communities, you can see that. I typically don't like those because it's really not an apples to apples approach, because what happens is several factors. One is you don't know the last time that they updated the fee study, so the fees could be 10 years old. You may also not understand that, well, maybe, I'm just making this up, not saying this is the fact, but let's say Brentwood only adopted 50% of their park and recreation fee, so that's why it's lower than the draft fee here. Or maybe your park fee includes trails and open space, but theirs doesn't, right? So we try to do as much research as we can to make it an equal playing field, but it really is an apples to oranges kind of approach. Some other things I think I should mention is, there are gonna be several things that have to be addressed in the ordinance itself, which is the ordinance is gonna implement the fees. So for instance, you're gonna have to make decisions about, at what point, like if I tear down a residential unit, in most cases, the community treats it as a one-for-one. So if I tear down an existing single-family house and build another one, typically there's no fee. But then some communities will put in there, well, if you've increased the floor area, if you've gone from a 2,000 square foot house to a 7,000 square foot house, maybe there's a difference. Also, changes of uses have to be addressed in there for, let's say, let's say I own a 5,000 square foot office building, and that office tenant goes out of business, and I now want to open up a music club. Well, a music club is a more intense use than the office use, and so typically the ordinances require that you basically pay the difference. So if the office use would have been $5,000, but retail is $7,500, well, you gotta pay the delta there, $2,500. So that's how typically, changes of use are considered in the fee study. Other things you have to provide for are independent fee calculation. So you've adopted this fee schedule, and let's say for retail, I have a project that's in a mixed-use environment, and I think that the retail prototype used to calculate the fees here doesn't reflect the demand that my project's going to have. Like, for instance, let's say it's more village or boutique retail, and we're using that sort of strip mall kind of retail as our prototype. And so I have an engineer that comes in and provides a study for me that says, look, this type of retail generates a trip rate of 38 per 1,000 square feet. You're using one that's 67 per 1,000 square feet. Now, you have to have a group or a body in place to review these, but it shouldn't be just a rubber stamp of, they just show you something, you rubber stamp it. You gotta go through it and make sure it makes sense and is logical, but you usually have to have some sort of avenue for somebody to appeal or do some sort of independent fee calculation. So that's another thing that we'll have to
We've
address.
got a lot to do.
Yeah.
Ms. Green?
I just want to say that I think that this is great that we're actually finally kind of getting to incorporate this. I think it's going to set us up for success. I don't think I have any questions. I'm just excited to see what the numbers are.
Move forward. Mr. Martin?
I have a couple questions, Carson. So first of all, I'll do them in reverse order. You talked about that appellate body. What do most jurisdictions do as far as that appellate body? Is it their planning commission?
So, that's a lot of places use planning commission. A lot of people will just, or some communities will just have a committee that may be made up of, like a lot of counties in Florida that have a lot of growth, they actually have an impact fee administrator. So it'll be the impact fee administrator, maybe a planning commissioner, maybe somebody from the Board of Zoning Appeals. It'll just be sort of a multidisciplined body. I've even seen it where basically that impact fee administrator is basically like the impact fee czar. And they make the determination, right? And then they can appeal his decision or her decision to the city council or board of aldermen or county council, whatever your body is, right? So it just varies. We can offer guidance on that.
Okay. The other question I have, if you'll dig in just briefly on the credits, because an example would be we're building a wastewater treatment plant, and we're gonna be borrowing money for that. Or let's say, for instance, we were gonna be doing something for parks, police, and fire, and let's say the impact fee that was collected, or the system development fee that was collected, is not gonna pay that full amount. And we were gonna use, in the case of general fund, we would use property tax money, to offset that. Or in the case of the wastewater treatment plant, we would use ratepayer money to offset that. are you saying then because the impact fee had already been paid, we would then owe credits back to avoid double payment? I maybe I
No,
misunderstood
the
that.
credit will be baked into the methodology. So you don't have to go 5 years from now, give them money back. It basically looks at, okay, over the next 10 years, let's say that, I'm just gonna use round numbers, say the infrastructure cost is $10 million. And the growth-related property, the incremental property tax that would likely be generated by those units over the 10 years, that, and again, what portion of their total property tax is just gonna go to that, right? It's a small percentage.
Right.
So let's say the growth-related is 2 million of that 10 million. In simple terms, you're basically doing a net present value calculation of that 2 million. So the net is 8 because their property tax are gonna pay for the same thing they're paying the impact fee for.
Okay. So it's already, I see what you're saying.
Right,
It's already
right,
into the
Right.
number.
It's always better though, like for instance, in cases where we have communities that have dedicated revenue sources, for either roads or parks, something like that, it's always better if you cannot commingle the money, because then you don't have to give credits. Like for instance, with roads, a lot of times it's easy where any gas tax money you're getting, you're already using for maintenance, you're not using it to build capacity anyway. So as long as you're not mixing that money, you're fine. When, you know, if you've got a lot of places will use the, like if they've got a sales tax in Florida, for instance, for roads, they may be dedicating the roads or that sales tax for certain projects, like for instance, using it for state projects. So if they come to the table with more money, they can get the road done quicker, or they're using it to correct safety and deficiencies or other things.
Sure.
And then using the impact fees for the growth component, so there's no commingling of the funds, you don't have to give credit.
Okay. That makes sense. That helps me understand that concept.
No more questions? Anyone else have any questions?
All I'm saying is, you know, we were talking this up, using references as Nashville's coming our way, being discovered by America that this is a good city to live in. And it's just that we, the leaders, gotta get that vision and be willing to take that risk. Because we can't stay complacent, turn it back. Because, I'm gonna say the majority of our citizens are ready for the growth. So it's just up to leadership to make sure we just move with the vision.
And we will be scheduling a date in the near future to come back and talk about this for a special meeting, so, yes, sir.
I'll give one more update just for you all that are here and for, I know Alderman Trotter, or Vice Mayor Harris and Alderman Arnold will catch up, so we are recording this for them. But that number, Mr. Vice referenced a 1,000 unit number. So far, what has been approved or is in the approval stages are 2,558 residential units for the city. Those are what I call not in the idea stage. Those are the ones that are either waiting for building permits to be issued, or those are engineering work has been done to put those on paper and are going through the approval stages. So that's 824 of those are single family, and then the rest of those are some combination of multi-residential, 372, well, actually over 800 townhomes, 576 apartments, and 32 cottage homes. But the grand total right now, and it just goes up, there's an annexation request coming your way next month on the Roger Blackwood property, and that's added 238 units to that total, so.
That's going up the hill.
It's going out to the park,
Okay.
And you know, this is what we've talked about for a long time,
Yeah.
for the ones of us that have been on the board for a long time. We've talked about wanting growth, here we are. Brings a whole new set of problems. All good problems. All good problems.
Good trouble, huh?
Good trouble. Any further discussion? Meeting's adjourned.